Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
The ballroom was glowing with warm light, the kind that makes every champagne glass sparkle like it was cut from crystal, and every person inside seemed to be smiling just a little too wide, as if the entire evening were staged for a glossy magazine spread about perfect families and their golden children. My brother, Ethan, stood at the center of it all, his suit tailored so precisely it looked like it had been sewn directly onto his skin, and his new title, Senior Vice President, rolled off every tongue like a prayer. People crowded around him, slapping his back, raising glasses in his honor, reminding him, as if he needed reminding, that he was the success story every parent dreams of. And then there was me, tucked into the corner like a misplaced piece of furniture, holding a half-empty flute of champagne that had long gone flat, watching the same people who never remembered my name lean in just to bask in a spotlight. I had grown used to being the shadow in these gatherings, the quiet one who came and left without leaving an impression, the sister nobody asked about because they already knew the answer. She's the dropout, the one who couldn't hack it at college, the one playing at business with her little startup that supposedly limped along like a wounded animal. I smiled when people made jokes at my expense, because what else was I supposed to do? Defend myself in a room where the evidence of my inadequacy, in their eyes, was written in gold letters across Ethan's resume? No, I had learned that silence kept me invisible, and invisibility was often safer than confrontation. The speeches began after dessert was cleared, and I felt my body tense as Ethan was ushered onto the stage. His grin was wide, the practiced kind of smile that said he knew how to look both humble and superior in the same breath, and his voice carried through the speakers with that Ivy League polish that our father loved to point out was worth every penny. He thanked his mentors, his colleagues, his family, and then, just when I thought I might have escaped unnoticed, he tilted his glass in my direction, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement. And of course, he said, his words dripping with a confidence that needed no permission, let's not forget my little sister. The dropout. The dreamer. The one who decided to play entrepreneur instead of doing the sensible thing and finishing school. We should all admire her persistence, even if it's led her company straight into the ground. Maybe one day, when she's ready to admit defeat, she'll sell it to me, and I'll make something real out of it. Laughter rippled across the room, not the kind that fills a space with joy, but the sharp, nervous laughter of people who don't want to look rude by staying silent. I saw one woman glance at me, her eyes darting quickly away, as though catching my reaction might make her complicit in my humiliation. And then I saw my father, standing at the edge of the stage, nodding. He didn't wince, didn't flinch, didn't rush to smooth over the cruelty of the moment. He simply nodded, lips pressed into that thin line that had always meant agreement, as though Ethan's words were not a joke at all but a plan, a future that had already been sketched out with me erased. I felt the weight of their dismissal press down on me, heavier than any insult spoken directly to my face. The room blurred slightly, not from tears. I had taught myself years ago never to cry in public, but from the realization that nothing had changed and nothing ever would. To them, Ethan was the heir, the chosen one, the embodiment of everything they valued, and I was the reminder of what happens when someone dares to take a different path and fails. So I did what I always did. I placed my glass down carefully, made sure my footsteps were light, and slipped out before anyone noticed I was leaving. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and sobering, and as I walked away from the glowing windows of the hotel, I could still hear faint echoes of applause trailing behind me, as if the world itself wanted to remind me of where I stood. But here's the truth they didn't know, what they could never imagine in their carefully curated vision of my failure. I had stopped caring about their approval a long time ago. I had learned to live with the label of dropout, to wear it until it no longer burned, to let them believe I was weaker, smaller, easier to dismiss. And while Ethan was polishing his speeches and collecting titles, I had been doing something far less glamorous, something far quieter, but infinitely more dangerous. I had been building, piece by piece, brick by brick, a fortress they couldn't see until it was too late. So when I left that party, I wasn't crushed, I wasn't broken, and I wasn't beaten. I was calm, deliberate, and certain in a way I hadn't been in years. Because I knew something none of them knew, something that would turn their smug smiles into stunned silence. The takeover Ethan joked about in front of a room full of strangers? That part was real. But the takeover wasn't his. It was mine. I used to think the word dropout was a stain that would never wash out, a permanent marker line across my name that would follow me into every room and sit on my lap during every holiday dinner. Yet over time I learned that a label only has as much power as the person holding the marker, and in my family the hand gripping it was always the same, my father's, steady and convinced, while my brother stood beside him like an endorsement stamped in Ivy League ink. When Ethan got into the School of Dreams, neighbors baked pies, my mother bought a pennant, and our living room turned into a shrine to achievement, while my acceptance to a small program I left after a year became an unspoken cautionary tale. A story they told with their eyes whenever I walked in late from another shift and set my keys down too loudly. It is funny, in a way that isn't funny at all, how quickly a house becomes a scoreboard, how a diploma can be waved like a family flag, and how a daughter without the right paperwork can be treated like an administrative error the universe forgot to correct. I built my company the way some people recover from a long illness, slowly and with too many setbacks to count, and every time I thought I was past the worst of it, a new fever spiked. A deal fell through, a supplier changed terms, a partner called me kiddo on a conference call and suggested I find adult supervision, which I suppose meant a man in a darker suit with a firmer handshake. I did not have the language they admired, the strategic memos that sounded like sermons, the networking brunches where everyone wore that particular smile that says we will pretend to be friends until the ink dries. What I had was a stubborn streak, a willingness to ask the question after the meeting ended, and an allergy to the kind of arrogance that keeps smart people from listening. For years I learned by doing and by failing, which is the education nobody brags about in speeches, and piece by piece I found the people who did not mind that my office was 2 rented rooms above a nail salon and that my furniture came from liquidation sales, as long as I kept my promises and paid my invoices on time. At home none of that mattered, because results that did not glitter under chandeliers never counted as results. And Ethan's quarterly bonuses were held up like sacred scrolls, while my scrappy wins were treated as temporary reprieves before the inevitable collapse. My father did not mean to be cruel. He would say he was only being practical, but there is a kind of practicality that feels like being told you are not invited to your own life. And for years I swallowed it whole because arguing with certainty is like trying to board a moving train without a ticket. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular when Ethan explained compounding returns over pie as if he had invented the concept, and when I mentioned a client I had just landed he nodded slowly and said, "That's nice, but when you are ready to scale, let me know and I'll introduce you to real capital," and the room hummed with the comfort of a hierarchy everyone had agreed to long ago. What none of them saw, what they could not see because they did not look, was the quiet network forming underneath the noise. The late-night calls with Maya, who had peeled away from a tired corporate job to become the kind of chief financial officer who actually answers her phone. The cautious lunches with Kaplan, who invests in the unglamorous corners of the market where profits are earned in inches instead of headlines. The patient legal architecture Denise built like a scaffold around my chaos, so that when the wind picked up, the whole thing did not sway. I let the myth of my failing company breathe because it kept certain birds circling, and birds that circle will eventually land if you leave enough crumbs in the right places. Which is how I learned that Ethan had been courting one of our shared suppliers with promises of scale and prestige and a handshake agreement that would lock my company out of favorable terms by the next quarter. So I did something small that looked like nothing and felt like a warm stone in the palm of my hand. With Kaplan's help, I quietly purchased a sliver of the receivables that supplier had been hoping to leverage for a short-term bridge. Just enough to give me a legitimate seat at a conversation they assumed did not involve me, and then, using a clause that had been sitting ignored in a legacy contract I had paid too much to protect, I triggered a routine review that temporarily froze changes to pricing and volume until a neutral auditor signed off. It was not dramatic and it did not make a sound, yet by the time the party balloons deflated and the caterer packed up the last crate, a small but meaningful stream of product that Ethan had planned to parade in front of his new team simply turned into a trickle, which meant his Monday presentation would suddenly have gaps that a polished deck could not patch. I did not gloat. I did not send a message. I did not wave a flag. I just watched the email confirmations arrive one by one, a wave of quiet satisfaction rolling through me like steady tidewater, and I thought, this is how you move a wall without shoving. Later that night, as the hotel lights dulled and the valet stand emptied, I sat in my car and looked at the city the way you study a chessboard in the last minutes of a long match. Not searching for victory fireworks, but for the angle that turns a smug certainty into a slow realization. I drafted a single line to Lauren, an editor who once returned my call when nobody else would, asking if she could hold a spot on the morning business brief for a story under embargo. Nothing splashy. Just a heads up that a mid-market acquisition might hit before the opening bell, and that the language should emphasize how the buyer had been underestimated. She replied with a thumbs up made of words and a timestamp that told me she would be awake before dawn, and I placed my phone face down on the passenger seat, the screen still glowing faintly like an exit sign at the back of a theater. I do not know if revenge is the right word for what I felt, because revenge implies shouting, and I have always preferred quiet, yet there was a sweetness in the restraint. A private humor in the way a single clause and a tiny purchase could tilt a room full of confidence, and as I pulled away I imagined Ethan rehearsing his victory speech in a mirror while a calendar invite he did not know existed ticked closer. By morning, they would come with papers and smug smiles to take over the company they had already declared a failure, expecting doors to swing and signatures to fall into line. By sunrise, they would find that every lock they thought they owned refused to turn, and that the headline they planned to write for me had somehow been drafted with their names instead. When the morning came, I knew they would arrive with the same certainty that made them nod at banquets and laugh at my expense. Because men like my father and my brother believed ownership was not something you earned, but something that naturally extended from their hands like a birthright. I stood behind the glass doors of my office, the same doors they had described as temporary because no real company could possibly operate out of a building without valet parking, and I listened to the heavy footsteps in the hallway, the confident rhythm of shoes that had never hesitated at thresholds. Ethan's voice carried first, loud and sure, rehearsed for an audience that would applaud his efficiency, and my father's followed, slower but more dangerous, as though the authority in each word was carved from stone. They pushed the handles, expecting them to give way easily, expecting the smell of cheap coffee and the clatter of keyboards, expecting me sitting at a desk like a defeated tenant waiting to sign over my last rites. But the locks had been changed the night before, replaced while I watched the metal twist into place, and when the handles resisted, I could almost hear the disbelief settle into their throats. My father tried first, jiggling as though persistence might change physics. Then Ethan shoved his shoulder into the glass with a muttered curse, the sound echoing in the hallway like the beginning of a storm. Inside, my team worked in silence, every eye on me, every keystroke another reminder that what we were doing was real, that this was not a game of make-believe entrepreneurship, but the culmination of months of gritted teeth and careful patience. I had been playing the dropout, the failure, the distraction, while in the background the paperwork mounted, signatures stacked neatly in legal folders that weighed more than their assumptions. I had investors who believed in numbers, not surnames, and contracts that did not flinch under scrutiny, and when the headlines hit the wires in just a few hours, it would no longer matter what they called me at dinners or how many times they rolled their eyes at my persistence. The trap had not been built in anger, but in discipline, in the long nights of listening instead of speaking, in the careful way I let them underestimate me so completely that they could not imagine I was already 3 steps ahead. Ethan thought he had charmed our suppliers into quietly tightening the noose, but I had been sitting in side rooms with their accountants, offering stability in exchange for loyalty, and the kind of contracts that made short-term flash look brittle compared to long-term guarantees. My father thought his silence would shape me into a dependent, desperate for approval, but I had learned to treat silence as a resource, a space where I could think without interruption and prepare without boasting. As they stood outside, rattling a door that no longer opened for them, I remembered every conversation where I was told to wait, to listen, to take the scraps of opportunity left behind by the real contenders. I remembered the Thanksgiving when my father announced that Ethan's internship at a major bank was the proudest moment of his life, while I cleared plates from the table because no one noticed I had been working 2 jobs just to keep my company alive. I remembered the way my brother once leaned over my shoulder at a barbecue, beer in hand, and said, "Playtime doesn't last forever, you know," before walking away to another round of applause. What they didn't realize was that playtime had ended long ago, and the moment they treated me as harmless was the exact moment I became dangerous. Every contract signed in secret, every investor who agreed to remain silent until the ink dried, every headline drafted and scheduled under embargo was another brick in the wall they didn't see rising until they walked straight into it. And now, while they stood in the hallway, whispering to each other about calling a locksmith or finding a back entrance, I leaned against my desk and let the weight of the moment press into me. I did not smile, because triumph is heavier than that, and I did not gloat, because gloating is for those who win by accident. I simply waited, calm and steady, knowing that within hours the world would no longer recognize the hierarchy they had built. They thought this was the morning of their takeover, the day they finally cut away the failing branch of the family tree and absorbed what was left into Ethan's carefully polished empire. But the truth was simpler and sharper than that. The takeover had already begun, and it was not theirs. It was mine. And as the first buzz of a notification lit up my phone with the subject line, "Breaking, Acquisition Reshapes Market Expectations," I knew the silence that would follow would not belong to me this time. It would belong to them. The alert landed like a soft knock rather than a drumroll, a tidy line of text from Lauren with the link and a single sentence, "Live in 2 minutes," so I asked Maya to kill internal chat noise and told the team to keep their heads down. Because there is a delicate moment between a fuse catching and the flame reaching powder when you can still ruin everything by celebrating too early. I watched the corporate news feed tick forward with the indifferent rhythm of a metronome, names and numbers sliding past as if none of them mattered more than any other, until the screen paused the way a person inhales before a difficult truth. And then the headlines stepped into the open with calm handwriting that made the words feel inevitable. My supposedly failing company had agreed to acquire my brother's shop at a valuation that looked almost gentle until you read the terms and saw how. The leverage worked in one direction only. For a breath I thought of all the times I tried to explain compound pressure to people who preferred compound praise, how 100 small choices can become a single outcome that appears overnight to those who were not paying attention. And then my phone began buzzing like an angry hive, investors confirming, counsel forwarding signed exhibits, Denise flagging 2 phrases she wanted tweaked before the long-form release hit the wires, Kaplan sending a rare congratulations that read more like a line from a ledger than a hug, which was exactly what I needed. Across the glass, Ethan's reflection wavered as he finally caught the news on his own screen, his mouth opening just enough to make room for a question he had never practiced asking, and for a second I saw the boy he used to be. The one who believed that if he followed the manual step by step he would be safe from surprises, and I felt something in me flicker, not quite pity and not quite triumph, more like the understanding that a bridge has burned and you smell it before you see the flames. The first calls were from reporters who had ignored me for years and now used my first name with a familiarity that would have been funny if it weren't so predictable, so I gave them measured phrases and clean verbs and refused to dance for any of them. Because the numbers would do the talking and the filings would do the rest. The second wave was angrier and less articulate board members from Ethan's side who had never taken my meeting, but now wanted to understand strategic intent, which is boardroom code for who is going to eat the loss and who will be photographed pretending not to mind. I used humor like a pocket knife, small and practical, telling one of them that perhaps the dropout had finally bought herself an MBA the long way around, and the silence that followed was so pure I could have framed it. My father's name flashed and I let it ring 3 times, not to be cruel, but to remind myself that I was no longer a person waiting for permission. Then I picked up and listened to him ask how I could embarrass the family. As if humiliation were a property deed he held and I had trespassed without knocking. I told him the transaction was standard and had been negotiated at arm's length by grown-ups who read documents before they signed them, and if that sounded colder than I intended, well, cold is a temperature you earn when warmth has been rationed for years. He said this was not what Ethan deserved, and I agreed in a quiet voice that surprised us both, because I did not believe in deserts or cosmic scorecards, only in the long arithmetic of choices. And in that arithmetic Ethan had bet on charm while I had bet on clauses. In the bullpen someone exhaled, the kind of relieved sound that happens when a roller coaster clears the highest hill, and I raised a hand for patience because the ride was not over. The integration plan was already in motion, accounts payable mapped, redundancies assessed with more compassion than anyone had shown me when I sat in borrowed chairs, and a transition package drafted for Ethan's people that treated them like professionals rather than collateral, because if I have learned anything, it is that generosity given out loud is often marketing, while generosity written into line items can change how a week feels for a person you will never meet. Ethan appeared in the doorway finally, not shouting, not performing, simply standing in a suit that suddenly looked like a costume, and he asked me, very softly, how long I had been planning this. Which is the wrong question if you have not yet accepted that the planning is not a moment but a muscle. I told him we could talk in a conference room at noon if he wanted clarity rather than theater, and he laughed without humor and said clarity was overrated, then glanced at the scrolling headline on my monitor and asked whether I was proud of this. Whether winning like this made the food taste better and the nights quieter. I said pride was the wrong measurement and sleep was a negotiation, then reminded him that the severance terms for his top lieutenants were better than fair and that no one would find a padlock on their laptop. Because revenge that burns the furniture is just arson, and I prefer architecture. He took a step forward as if to say something else, then looked at the locked door behind him and the unlocked door beside me and decided he was not ready to choose a path inside either space, so he turned and left without a word, and the room felt larger by an inch, which is enough space to breathe when the air has been held in your chest for too long. I signed 2 more documents that moved money like weather and approved a press line that would make sense to the market even if it would never make sense at my parents' table, and then I stood at the window and watched the city pretend it had always known this was coming. By late afternoon the ticker had steadied, the rumor mill had eaten its own tail, and the emails that once came addressed to Dear Sir now remembered my name without squinting, which would have been delightful if delight were the point. Instead, there was only the clean sensation of a ledger balancing at last, and the faint ache of a story ending in a register none of us learned in school. I told Maya to cue the integration memo and to give herself the evening off. Then I powered down my monitor and placed my phone face down the way you do when you are not done, but you are finished for now. At dusk, when the lights outside began to smear into rivers on the glass and the office smelled like tired coffee and a beginning, the security line blinked to accept a visitor I had not scheduled, and the camera showed a familiar profile waiting without impatience. It was not Ethan, and it was not my father, and the name on the temporary badge made my stomach dip as if the floor had quietly moved, because some doors do not lead to celebration or apology, but to the bill that comes due. When the dust of the headlines settled into something quieter and the flood of congratulatory messages slowed into a manageable stream, I thought perhaps the silence would finally feel like victory. The kind of silence where you can stretch your arms without hitting invisible walls and breathe without tasting resentment in the air. Yet what greeted me in the evenings was not the calm I had imagined, but a hollowness that clung to every corner of my apartment, a kind of echo that no amount of celebratory champagne could drown. People called me brilliant, called me ruthless, called me the surprise of the quarter, but none of those words filled the space at the family table where I once sat praying for acknowledgement. Nor did they soften the look on my brother's face when he realized the rules of the game had been rewritten without his consent. Ethan showed up one night, not at the office where cameras could watch him, but at my door, shoulders hunched in a way that made his expensive jacket hang loose, as if even fabric had decided to stop fitting him. He did not shout, did not demand, did not lecture the way he used to when he explained business concepts to me as though I were still a child playing store with pennies. Instead, he asked a question so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. Was it worth it? His voice was not angry. It was tired, cracked around the edges, and for a moment I saw him not as the Ivy League heir, but as the boy who used to sneak cookies from the jar and beg me not to tell. I wanted to answer quickly, with the certainty of someone who had prepared a speech, but nothing came out because certainty was a currency I no longer trusted. My father stopped calling altogether, except once, when he left a voicemail I could not bring myself to delete. He said the family name had been dragged through the mud, that I had chosen spectacle over solidarity, and that no amount of profit could replace what I had destroyed. He did not mention my mother, who stayed silent as always, the way a person does when loyalty and exhaustion have become indistinguishable. I listened to that message 3 times before saving it to a hidden folder, not because I agreed, but because a part of me knew that even anger, when it comes from a parent, is still a thread that ties you to a place you once called home. In the office, the air was different. My team walked taller, investors treated me like an equal, and opportunities that had once required begging now arrived packaged in polite inquiries, as though everyone had agreed to rewrite history overnight. I should have felt triumphant, should have tasted the sweetness of having the last laugh, yet beneath every victory was the bitter knowledge that I had won not only the battle, but also the right to sit alone with it. The people who had mocked me were silent, yes, but silence is not the same as respect, and respect that arrives after conquest always feels like counterfeit currency. At night, I would catch myself replaying Ethan's words at the party, the way he had called me useless with such effortless confidence, and I realized the wound of that moment had not been erased by acquisition or headlines. It had only been buried under layers of contracts and clauses, hidden but still alive, pulsing like an ember that refused to die. I wondered if perhaps revenge was not about closure at all, but about proving to yourself that you could flip the script, even if the story it told afterward was darker than you expected. There were moments when satisfaction brushed against me, fleeting but real. Watching the analysts update their models to include my company's name, seeing employees who once doubted the future walk into work with pride, hearing whispers of admiration from competitors who had ignored me for years, those moments mattered. And I will not pretend they didn't. But there were also nights when I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of what had been lost, the chance of reconciliation, the hope of being seen without blood drawn, the possibility that family could be something more than rivalry disguised as tradition. I do not regret what I did. Regret is for mistakes, and this was no mistake. I had been cornered, dismissed, erased, and I chose not to vanish, but to fight with the only tools I had. Still, as I sit here now, with the city lights flickering across the glass of an office that finally feels permanent, I cannot escape the question my brother asked me. Was it worth it? Perhaps worth is the wrong measure, because worth implies balance, and balance is not what I was chasing. I was chasing recognition, survival, and the power to prove them wrong, and I caught it all, but in catching it, I dropped something else that cannot be picked up again. They thought they could erase me, that I would fade quietly into the background of their carefully curated story. Instead, I erased the very idea of family I once wanted so desperately to belong to, and what remains is mine alone. Whether that is victory or ruin, I may never know, and perhaps that is the real price of revenge.